Alright, to start out, if you're going to be using a twin needle like me, you will need 2 spools of identical thread to thread through to do your top stitching. So if you only have 1 spool in the color that you need to use, you will want to put some of that thread onto a spare bobbin. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm putting the brown color thread onto my bobbin. I'm also going to switch out my regular sewing needle for a twin needle. If you are using a zigzag stitch for your stretch stitch today rather than a serger, you'll probably be switching back and forth between your twin needle and your regular needle. So I do suggest just trying to do as much of the assembly in batches as you can so as to avoid having to replace the needle over and over again. So a twin needle is thread through your machine the same way, just with 2 threads instead of 1, and then you're going to individually thread each needle and put the thread towards the back of the machine. Alright, here's my fabric. Today I'm using a rib knit sweater fabric, and I've got my pattern cut out. And I'm going to start by cutting out my bodice pieces on the fold of my fabric. Since I used a rib knit, seeing the grain line was very easy. So just be mindful of your grain line and cut out your front and back bodice pieces on the fold. You'll want 2 separate sleeve pieces, and they need to be mirrors of each other. So I like to do this by folding my fabric in half and cutting it on the 2 layers so that I have 2 exact mirrors of each other. And this also helps with pattern matching. Alright, for the waistband, wrist cuffs, and neckband, you can either use the fabric you're already using or you can use ribbing. If you plan to use your self fabric, make sure that the largest amount of stretch is going against the grain line marked on the pattern piece so that you have the largest amount of stretch going horizontally. Alright, and so before we begin, we're just going to mark into our seam allowance a little bit, our notches, and center front on our front bodice piece. And you'll want to mark all of the notches on all of the pieces, as well as with chalk or with Tailor soap, mark the front and back bodice pieces so that they are discernible. The notches do match up to help this, but it is helpful also to have it with chalk. So we are lining up the shoulder seams now with front bodice and the right sleeve, right sides together. We are pinning along the edge, making sure that our notches are lined up and making sure the edge of the fabric is also lined up. Next, we will be doing it with the left sleeve as well. And once we have this all pinned up, we will take it to our serger or our sewing machine to sew along the edge. Whether you're using a serger or a sewing machine with a zigzag stitch, our seam allowance is 1/4 inch. So keep that in mind while you're using your stretch stitch to basically follow the edge and make sure that your stitch width is 1/4 inch. So once we have both of these seams finished and the left and right sleeves connected to the front bodice, we will then, right sides together, attach the other side of the sleeves to the back bodice. It's pretty much the same process. You're just connecting the shoulder seams and sewing that with your serger or your zigzag stitch. Once you're done with all of your seams, make sure to iron the seams towards the bodice because we will be top stitching these down. And this is what it should look like. Alright, now we are using our twin needle, so I'm setting my stitch length to a little bit longer than usual, and I'm making sure that if my machine has a twin needle setting that I'm using it. And I am making sure that my seam allowance is folded and pressed towards my bodice as I sew this down, but you'll just want to take it slow, and you're going to do this on every one of our seams that we just made. Also, I do want to mention that even if you don't have a twin needle, you can use a zigzag stitch here, or you can omit top stitching completely. I've done versions without top stitching, and it is totally a personal choice, and I encourage you to have fun. Alright, and this is what it should look like after you've top stitched everything. And next we are going to prep all of our cuffs. So we are folding together, right sides together, our neckband and sewing the short edge with our serger or zigzag stitch. And we are going to also do this with the waistband cuff and the wristband cuffs. We are basically forming a circle with each one that we do. I would recommend doing this all at once just to save time throughout your construction process. All right, now that we've got all of those ready, we are going to fold them in half, kind of hot dog style, but we're going to fold our seam allowance to the left and to the right respectively so as to not make that seam line really bulky. We're going to pin that in place, and then we are going to pin the entire cuff into quarters. So we're going to put a pin directly across from the pin that we just placed at the seam. And then we are going to fold it in half again, lining up the pins that we just placed to find the other quarters. So we're going to pin those as well. You're going to do this to the waistband as well as the wrist cuffs. So if you want to just go ahead and do all of this step at once for everything, it might be a little helpful. Next, we are going to divide the neck hole into quarters as well by lining up the seams that we previously made and lining up the pins that we placed to find the other quarters. All right, so we're going to flip that garment over to the wrong side, and we're going to line up the pins that we just placed at center back and the seam line of the neckband, and we're going to pin that in place. And then you're going to pin at all of the other quarters, like so. And next we are going to go in between each pin and find, the middle spot between those two pins and pin it there. And then find the middle spot between those two pins and pin it there until all of the fabric is evenly distributed between pins throughout the neck hole. But this is what it should look like, and we're going to take that over to our serger or our machine. I like to remove one pin and kind of slide it under the serger to get started at center back, and slowly taking out a pin as we go. We don't want to stretch the fabric as we go, but since there's a little bit of difference between the neckband and the neck opening, you'll just want to slightly stretch that fabric to make sure that it's even. And also double checking as you go to make sure that all 3 layers that you're sewing through are lined up at the edge so you don't miss any. And you're also going to iron this seam allowance towards the bodice, and we're also going to top stitch this down using your twin needle or your cover stitch machine. All right, that's what we're looking like, and now we're folding it right sides out, and we're going to press that towards the bodice, and we're going to top stitch that down. As I'm sure you can tell, a lot of the steps are very similar, and they will continue to be very similar as we add the wristbands and the waistband. All right, so now we are going to sew along the side seam, and we are going to pin at the wrist, at the waist, and at the underarm seam to make sure that is all lined up. We're going to find the middle point, and then we're going to find the middle point again. So on and so forth until that fabric is evenly distributed. There shouldn't be too many discrepancies here. It should line up pretty nice. All right, and we're taking that to our serger or machine, and we are sewing along the edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, now we're going to divide our armhole openings into quarters as well to line up the cuffs that we previously quartered. And we're going to slide that in, right sides together, lining up the cuffs seam with the arm seam and pinning that in place. And then lining up the rest of our pins, pinning those in place, finding the middle, pinning that in place, and so on and so forth until the fabric is evenly distributed along the whole armhole opening. And this is what it should look like. And we're going to take this to our serger or our machine and basically do the same process that we did for the neck hole opening. We're going to sew that in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you can optionally top stitch this down with a twin needle or a cover stitch machine if you'd like. That's what that should look like when you're done. And yes, we are going to repeat the exact same process for the waistband by lining up the quarters of the waistband and the waist opening, dividing the distance and pinning in place until all that fabric is evenly distributed. Taking that to the serger or our machine and sewing it in place. And then, yep, you guessed it, we are going to top stitch with a twin needle or cover stitch machine after pressing towards the bodice. All right, when you are all finished, you can give everything a good final press. And also, if the twin needle gets a little wavy on you, you can use steam to help with that issue. And like I said, if you use ribbing instead of your self fabric, it is just going to lay better. But I wanted to give the option for those of you who want to use what you got. So that is how to make the penny pullover. And I hope that you guys enjoyed.